Hello and welcome to The Exchange, Policy Exchange's podcast. I'm Ed Birkett, a Senior Research Fellow in the Energy and Environment team here at Policy Exchange. Today, Policy Exchange is launching a new research programme, Beyond COP26, in the run-up to the COP26 Climate Conference, which will be hosted by the UK later this year in Glasgow. Throughout the programme, we'll be looking at ideas and innovations that will allow the UK to make a global impact on decarbonisation whilst growing the green economy at home. When we were putting together this programme, we thought who better to chair it than two former Energy Secretaries. So I'm delighted to be joined today by our two co-chairs, the Right Honourable Andrea Leadsom MP and the Right Honourable Amber Rudd. Andrea Leadsom is the Member of Parliament for South Northamptonshire. She served in several government roles, including Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Leader of the House of Commons, Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Energy Minister and City Minister. Amber Rudd served as Member of Parliament for Hastings and Rye between 2010 and 2019. During that time, she served as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and Home Secretary. And I'm delighted to have both of them joining me today. So Amber, you stepped down from Parliament in 2019. What have you been up to since then?
Thanks, Ed. Great pleasure to be doing this with you, and more particularly with Andrea, who's my old friend, of course. I'm sure we'll come on to that later. Since I left at the end of 2019, I decided to get back involved in the energy sector. When I reflected on my time in Parliament and in various ministries, as you kindly set out, I decided that energy is where I wanted to get involved in the private sector. So I'm very fortunate. I have a number of roles in the private sector, which help me feel relevant, involved, and hopefully help the private sector push forwards into a clean world. As we know, mostly private companies are now embracing net zero. I'm helping them do that. And it's a great pleasure to be working now from the private sector together with yourselves and Andrea Leadsom in the public sector.
Thanks, Amber. And Andrea, why did you and Amber want to come together to co-chair this programme?
Well, Ed, we kind of were great old buddies from 2005 when we first met on the campaign trail up in Liverpool. And we've been great friends all the way through. We had a slight hiccup, shall we say, in 2016 when she was Secretary of State for DEC and I was Energy Minister, and we disagreed over Brexit. So we had that very fundamental, sometimes rather bad tempered disagreement. But what's fantastic is, frankly, she bought me lunch last year, and it was all good from then on, because we both feel that the UK's future outside of the EU really does lie in the green economy, in leading the world in tackling global climate change, in exporting amongst our green USPs around the world and using our soft power to influence the rest of the world to decarbonise.
Okay, great. And that brings us on to the launch report that we published today, written by yourselves, called the UK's Green USPs, as part of this Beyond COP26 programme. What are the top line takeaways from that report?
Well, for me, the top line takeaway is about trying, as Andrea and I have done, to highlight what we think the UK really has as its strengths in trying to lead the world on the green revolution. Now, the UK, and particularly Boris Johnson, always say the UK has leadership in this, the UK is best at that. But I'm going to say it again, the UK really does have leadership in the green economy. It has extraordinary leadership, particularly over what's achieved in the past few years in terms of delivering on alternatives to oil and gas and, frankly, coal. So we've listed a number of areas where we think the UK should showcase more strongly, more confidently, what we can achieve in this area in order to help other countries do it, but also to make sure that we maximise the opportunity in the UK. And the first one that we're starting with is science and technology. And that's the area where you can see we can continue to build on, where we can lead and achieve so much.
Okay, great. And the second one of the green USPs is financial services. And Andrea, I know that's an area you take particular interest. Why is that something that the UK should really be pushing in the discussion around net zero?
Obviously, the UK is preeminent in the world in financial services, and it's something that we are able, right across the world, to influence both regulation and ideas for financial services. So I know that our rock star central banker, Mark Carney, became the government's green advisor on finance in the run up to COP26. And I think that we really can lead the world in building a green financial revolution that focuses on patient capital, equity finance, issues around carbon offset, the means by which different private sector companies and governments can actually fund their long-term decarbonisation strategies. So I believe that the UK has the know-how and the expertise to really assist the world in the area of finance.
Okay, and then the final theme is one we're calling political leadership on climate change. And this is one area where the UK really has led the world, and we've had a really strong consensus across Parliament. Is there any particular reason why you think the UK has had that strong cross-party consensus on climate change, whereas other countries haven't had that?
Well, it's so interesting that, isn't it? I think it's a cultural issue whereby our Conservative Party, which is what Andrea and I obviously are part of, embraces this just as strongly as the Labour Party. And in many countries, and I sort of use America as the example, the Republicans have not embraced it. And in fact, as we saw, Donald Trump did in fact take the US out of the Paris Agreement, which is the leading agreement internationally to try to decarbonize the world. And it wasn't always so, of course. I mean, some Conservatives in the past, and let's face it, a few now, but only a smaller few than ever before, actually didn't support climate change action the way we do now. But we do have cross-party consensus, and I think it's unusual. But what it gives, of course, is the stability to the markets to really invest in it. So building on the second point that Andrea was setting out in terms of finance, again, it gives even more steady security for people wanting to invest money and find financial solutions to climate change to be able to do that in the UK, because they know we're not going to kind of suddenly change it. So I think it's really important, and I hope that we get more of it from other countries.
And very specifically, I think the UK can help the rest of the world in things like, we passed our own Climate Change Act, we've legislated to ensure decarbonisation. Not many other countries have done that, but taking our lead, a number of them are now doing that. We have the Committee on Climate Change, we have our carbon budgets. These are all new ideas that have originated from the UK that we can help other countries who want to do so to take our lead and regulate in their own parliaments.
Okay, great. And Andrea, right. The significance, if I may, Ed, is not just the fact that we've got the Climate Change Act supported by the two main parties, but also that we put in place then the carbon budget. So you can't just say we're going to do this by 2050. It has kind of completely accountable, regular reviews of whether the country is actually keeping up with its targets. And I think it would be fantastic if other countries did have that. Some of them have started to adopt it, but the more transparency we have over these targets, the more likely we are to achieve them.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, the green USPs are great. We have some real strengths, but both Amber and I absolutely agree. This is about jobs, growth, levelling up, opportunities from apprenticeships all the way to brilliant science and retraining for, North Sea oil engineers for in the industrial heartlands in England. So this is a huge opportunity for the government's agenda to spread economic growth as we build back from COVID. So it's not just about the sort of theoretical green USPs, nor is it just about sort of, influencing the rest of the world, but it's also a great bit of business for UK PLC.
Okay, and in the that's actually a good segue into the launch report, where you talk about how these three green USPs lead to green export opportunities, and one of the obvious ones is offshore wind. But you alongside the report, you've published an opinion piece calling on the government to do more to support UK manufacturers of offshore wind turbines and components. What's the change you'd like to see there?
Yeah, so the issue there is that back in 2015, when Amber was Secretary of State and I was Energy Minister, we were really trying to get a UK supply chain for offshore wind. It was this new industry. We were using bill payer subsidies to fund the contracts for difference. And at the same time, all of the parts, the towers, the foundations, the blades, they were all being imported, so of no benefit to UK PLC. And at the time, we were pitching for the carbon footprint of the supply chain to be taken into account. And unfortunately, we were advised that EU procurement rules would not permit that to be taken into account. So we had to accept that potentially, Polish or somewhere elsewhere around the world using coal-fired power stations for manufacturing processes and then shipping on diesel ships over to the UK was the way forward, in spite of this supposedly being an attempt at decarbonisation. So, however, now that we're out of the EU, we now have the opportunity to really press for change that enables us to look at the full carbon footprint of any manufacturing process in the renewables sector. And that will give UK businesses the opportunity to bid competitively. And Amber, I know we've talked about the WTO a bit and some of the challenges there.
Yes, I mean, what is I think is so good about this idea, which Andrea worked on 5 or 6 years ago but couldn't deliver on, is that it is a form of carbon tax on a specifically renewable import, which is the renewable energy, which is the core of the UK's success. So our proposal is about trying it out in this particular sector. I mean, of course, there will be various people who will say you can't do it according to these rules, you can't do it according to those rules, but this is an opportunity to try out in a small scale what is entirely relevant to delivering on our lower carbon future. So we think it could be transformational in terms of the sector and in terms of showing that the UK not only has the leadership because of the amount of offshore wind it's developed and therefore the skills it's shown and the pricing, of course, which has come down so significantly, but also that it should be done in a way that reduces carbon with the content. So it's sort of wholly virtuous in a way if we manage to do it.
Yeah, and if necessary, if we have to change international rules, WTO rules, if governments have to get together to do that, then I would point people to the agreement that the Chancellor Rishi Sunak has just made with other nations on a digital tax. It was always said, oh, you'll never do it because you have to all get together and do it. Well, there we are. That is now happening. And I'm absolutely certain we can do the same with carbon and look at a proper adjustment tax that enables us to really own the problem, not just play games with our own territorial emissions, but actually look at the whole supply chain and where those emissions are coming from.
Okay.
And people have always been talking about how desirable it would be to have a carbon tax, but it feels like such a big step. Nobody can actually see how we can get there. And what we're proposing here is a small but significant step towards actually having that.
Okay, great. And actually, it might be worth just reflecting on some other issues that were live in the time when both of you were working in the Department for Energy and Climate Change in 2015. And one of those was the announcement that the UK would phase out coal-fired power stations from the electricity sector by 2025. So how did that come about? Amber is probably who's best to go on that one.
Well, I was just yeah. Well, I was just going to say that it was in the context of the tightest electricity margins ever that winter. So we really were faced with, this risk of the lights going out, that trilemma of energy security, keeping bills down and decarbonising. So it was, in theory at least, it was the worst possible time to do it. But sorry, Amber, I interrupted you.
Well, it was the growing success, really, of existing renewable sources. It became evident that we were going to use less and less coal over the next decade. And we decided to send a very strong signal that coal was not just going to reduce, but was going to end. And so we put together our announcement for 2025. And the fact is, the wind was going that way, but we were able to sort of capture that wind really by putting a marker down and saying it's going to end by 2025, which can't prove it entirely, but it felt like it accelerated it. But it also sent such a strong signal to the rest of the world. We were the first developed country to do so, to put a date on ending coal. And there was a huge sort of sharp intake of breath as everybody else took a sort of second look at their own numbers and thought, well, if the UK can, maybe we can too. And that is the sort of strong signalling that the UK can do. And if we get it right, it can be highly influential.
I so agree. And what was so interesting at the time, there was this outcry of, oh, the lights will go out, you'll never get coal off the system by then. But then, as Business and Energy Secretary, just 4 years later, already coal is virtually off the system. And the only reason we've not been able to bring the deadline even further forward is because there were a couple of bids into the 2024 capacity market for standby supply using coal-fired power stations. But other than that, as we know, we've had many, many weeks in recent months and the last couple of years where we've had no coal on the system whatsoever. So in my view, we use that as a bit of a prototype with the zero emissions from the tailpipe consultation for vehicles between the Department of Transport and BEIS just last year, where we announced that we want to set a date of 2032 and subsequently brought that forward to 2030. Because again, whilst the car sector will then get very concerned and, oh, we can't do it, the fantastic thing about private enterprise is that it is very fleet of foot. So if you set a hard target, businesses will always exceed that. And we've seen that time and time again in so many different areas. So my view as BEIS Secretary of State was we need to set dates, hard dates for every single sector of our economy, from home heating to transport to buildings, etc., so that businesses can then tackle that and change their processes accordingly. So I do think that that's the way to go.
Okay, so I guess some people might push back on that a little bit and say maybe that's not a particularly conservative approach, both being from the Conservative Party, to sort of set these deadlines and regulations on business. How would you respond to that?
I would say it's exactly what a Conservative would do, because we set the policy certainty and then the market responds. And coming back to perhaps our favourite example of offshore wind, we had to fight quite hard against George Osborne in order to keep those auctions in place, to keep the support for offshore wind. And he only agreed on the basis of bringing the auction price down, what felt like at the time a huge amount. And the offshore wind organisations all said to us, oh my God, that's far too low. We'll never be able to build for that. And now, 6 years later, they're building for half that. The market, as Andrea absolutely said, will exceed if you set clear policy targets. That's what they need from government.
Yeah, and certainly in addition to that, government support is there for these new technologies. So, the government, as Business Secretary, we were announcing huge support for things ranging from small modular reactors to carbon capture, usage and storage, innovation, to blue hydrogen. All of these new technologies require government sort of feed capital, and therefore it's absolutely right that government also sets the targets and then steps back and lets private enterprise get on with it.
Okay. And then I just got one last question actually for you, Andrea. So you were in the energy brief as energy minister in 2015-16, and then you came back into that brief in 2019. How much of the politics of climate change and the ambition around climate change changed in that period?
Well, that was the incredible thing, is that between 2015, where we unfortunately, try as we did, we weren't able to keep that £1 billion budget for carbon capture in 2015. But of course, by 2019, there was a very clear route to building and deploying carbon capture, usage and storage, and potentially building it into the future for the oil and gas sector in the North Sea basin, to ensure that we could use disused oil wells and so on for carbon storage. So all manner of change had happened in the interim. And of course, as Amber alluded to, the CFDs, the contracts for difference cost for offshore wind, had dropped significantly from something like £165 a megawatt hour to under £50 a megawatt hour. So extraordinary change. There are other areas, however, where there hadn't been as much movement, and that, of course, is in the supply chain. I do think, Amber and I both think very strongly that the UK supply chain really did not transform. It really didn't happen in that 4 or 5 year period. And that's what we're now pushing for in our launch for the Policy Exchange Beyond COP26 programme. And that is to see UK manufacturers and UK suppliers really getting in on the action so that we can create UK jobs as a result of our very clear commitment to decarbonisation. And the thing I would just finalise with is, whilst I was business secretary, we changed our whole strategy towards our number one priority being the UK leading the world in tackling global climate change. So I do think that our post-Brexit future is all about the green economy and building back better, levelling up all of the sort of favoured government slogans, but it is all about building back greener.
Okay, great. Well, that seems like a good and positive note to leave it on. So thank you so much to both of you for joining me today. To all of our listeners and viewers, please do check out the launch report for the Beyond COP26 programme on the Policy Exchange website. There'll be a number of short reports coming out over the coming months, along with events and keynote speeches, so do look out for that. And remember to follow Policy Exchange on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and through your usual podcast provider. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much to Amber Rudd and Andrea Leadsom for joining us today. And we're looking forward to working with you as you co-chair Policy Exchange's Beyond COP26 programme over the coming months.